How lucky was Missouri football in 2023? And why does it matter for 2024? Let's talk about it and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the merchant of Missouri mirth. On today's program, I want to talk about how the Missouri football odds, well, at least compared to the Ole Miss Rebels, in my opinion, on several levels, are a little bit odd. And yes, I am bound and determined to prove to some of my listeners that kickers just aren't quite as important as they think they are. But you know what? Before we start today's program, I do want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first ticket purchase. Terms apply. And I want to start off by talking about actually last season, how it does relate a little bit to 2024, in my opinion, at least in terms of narratives. Now, in a perfect world, well, narratives wouldn't matter that much, but unfortunately, that is not the world we live in. In particular, the world of college football versus, say, the NFL, where there's much more of a obvious, hey, here's who gets in the playoffs, and yes, the schedules aren't perfectly balanced, but a lot more balanced than they are in the world of college football. No question about that. And quite honestly, let's first of all start with the premise. What does luck mean in this context? Well, for me, I'm more of a big picture sort of guy. It's really a matter of, are you looking at the big picture or are you looking at moments? For example, Missouri, this past season in 2023 against Florida, we all remember the famous 4th and 17 completion by Brady Cook to Luther Burden. And you know what? That Florida linebacker, who in my opinion just didn't get enough depth, inexplicably, again on a 4th and 17. Are you worried about the crossing route in front of you? No, don't let the best receiver in the country get by you. Don't let him get behind you. So was Missouri a little bit lucky there? Yeah, certainly from that perspective. And statistically, you're usually not going to pick up a 4th and 17. But at the same time, you could say the same thing about Harrison Mevis and his 61-yard field goal. Yeah, statistically, most 61-yard field goals aren't going to go in. Just like you're not going to pick up a 4th and 17 more often than that. But both of those plays are also not lucky at the same time. Those took skill. Those are skill plays. That's a skill kick by Harrison Mevis. That's as good of a kick as you'll see in college football history. The longest kick in SEC history at that point, in fact. But again, we're talking about stat luck per se here. What is most likely to happen? The point here is that it's hard. The point I'm trying to make here is it's hard to count on picking up a 4th and 17, a do or die 4th and 17, or a 61-yard field goal for the win. Obviously, those things are not likely to happen in the aggregate. So in the aggregate, despite the fact that, yes, you could point to individual plays like the 4th and 17, certainly the 61-yard field goal, although as many readers have pointed out time and time again when I bring up this play, if Mevis had missed that kick, well, he would have gotten another shot at it. Kansas State committed a penalty on that play, so you're talking about a 56-yarder if indeed that kick hadn't gone in. So, but the point is, obviously, hey, then it goes to overtime. Who knows what happens there? Hey, if Missouri doesn't complete the Luke Bauer to Dominique Johnson touchdown pass, the fake punt, maybe they lose to Kentucky too. So from that perspective, you can say there were some real hinge moments there that made the entire Missouri season, essentially. You could also go the other way and say, hey, if Missouri hadn't fumbled the ball late against LSU, well, who knows? Maybe they were driving, looking to put some points on the board. I believe that was a 3rd and short situation. Missouri easily could have scored a touchdown and won that football game as well. So, but again, big picture, those were all just little moments. When you look at the big picture of the entire season, look how Missouri played not only in the do-or-die moments, but in an entire game against Tennessee, for example, where Missouri dominated a pretty above average, no doubt about it, Tennessee team and destroyed Arkansas, for example, and played a very close ball game against the Georgia Bulldogs down the stretch. So bottom line is, when you look at it, yes, the Tigers were probably in some ways, again, if you look at the little moments, sure, lots of teams that, as a Kansas City Chiefs fan, by the way, why they've had the best team for a few years now. They don't always win it when they have the best team. And really last year, that may have been the weakest Patrick Mahomes team of all, and yet they had some breaks and won the Super Bowl. So that's kind of football. You have to take a bigger picture look at it. And when you look at Missouri last season, 8th in the AP is where the Tigers finished. Well, if you look at, again, the advanced statistical, the numbers that's kind of take away the noise, that take away the 4th and 17 and the stuff that's unlikely to happen, those coin flip type moments. Well, S&P Plus, Bill Conley, the Mizzou guy, well, he had the Tigers 10th. So 8 versus 10th. What that suggests to me is actually, sure, there were some lucky moments that went the Tigers' way, and there were some unlucky moments that went against the Tigers as well that sometimes people forget. And beyond just those little moments, the bigger picture, well, there's a lot of moments of domination by Missouri that factor in just as much to, hey, again, those coin flip moments. So 8th in the AP and 10th in S&P Plus, well, that basically non-existent spread there, that tells me that Missouri ended up about where it deserved. And to me, why does this matter for 2024? Again, narratives. We're already seeing the narrative about Missouri having a relatively weak schedule being thrown around by a lot of Missouri's rivals and opposition. I saw a Tennessee fan throwing that back in my face earlier, and I realized, wait a second, Tennessee's projected schedule is not that much higher than Missouri, so let's maybe settle down a little bit, Vols fans. But again, at the same time, I just think that the reason this matters is because you don't want those types of narratives to take hold, because ultimately the 12-team college football playoff field is, for the most part, going to be selected by human beings. Yes, there's going to be some objective. There's going to be 4 automatic spots there, the winner of the Big 4 conferences, but the rest of those spots, including probably that group of 5 spot, well, it's going to be very subjective. So narratives, thinking, people and their biases, it all matters. So to me, this is why I want to get out in front of this narrative a little bit and remind people that, yes, the Tigers definitely had some do or die plays where they made it. Well, they had a couple that people don't remember maybe as well that went the other way. So again, just objectively speaking, 8th in the AP, 10th in S&P Plus, that's really all I need to know. That tells you that Missouri finished right about where it deserved in 2023 from a big picture perspective. Now, one thing I will point out, if you were the type of person who looked at the advanced statistical profile of Missouri from 2022, well, you would have realized that actually Missouri probably underperformed that year, and it would have led you to believe those, looking at the big picture versus those tiny moments like the against Auburn, for example, the famous chip shot missed field goal by Mevis and the fumble by Nate Peete at the very end of the ball game as well. If you just zoom out again and say, well, those things probably aren't likely to happen again, look at the bigger picture. Well, the Tigers were probably a quote-unquote better team than 6-6 in 2022. And that's not to say that literally they were better, of course. Your record is what it is, as Bill Parcells used to say. But what it would have led you to believe is that, oh, actually Missouri's probably going to be better in 2023 than most people believe. And I was certainly on that. I had the Tigers 16th in my preseason poll before the games kicked off last year. And obviously the Tigers ended up doing even better than that. But speaking of the odds, again, I think, if you looked at 2022 and those advanced stats, S&P Plus liked Mizzou better than its 6-6 record. Well, what do the stats think about Missouri this coming season, especially compared to another team that I like a lot this season as well, the Ole Miss Rebels? But you know what? Compared to Missouri, I think there's a bit of a spread there that's a little bit surprising to me. So I think the Tigers' odds are still a little bit off here. Let's take a bigger picture perspective of the odds coming up here in just a little bit. But first, have you seen Bobby Witt Jr. lately? My goodness, is he on fire, especially since the home run derby. Well, if you haven't seen him in person, I suggest you do for sure. In fact, you can get out to Kansas City and Kauffman Stadium tonight, 7:10 first pitch against the Diamondbacks, $15 all in at Gametime for your cheapest ticket, or you can go field box, lower level, just $21. That's a super deal, 9% off over at Gametime. And the beauty of Gametime is no matter where you find it, it's going to be even cheaper at Gametime. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. For your second listen tomorrow, I would actually suggest checking out Jay Stevens, a friend of the podcast, Locked On Buckeyes. Yes, we talked about the Cotton Bowl, of course, this past winter. But on tomorrow's Locked On Buckeyes, Jay's going to be talking about Jackson Cantwell. So, of course, a huge Missouri target there. Always interesting to get an outsider's perspective there. Jay's going to be talking to our buddy Brian Smith. So if you can't get enough of Brian or the Locked On Podcast Network, definitely check out Jay and Locked On Buckeyes tomorrow to hear about Jackson Cantwell. But right now, you know what? I want to talk about the odds over at FanDuel. And this is not an ad read, folks. This is just, well, they're a longtime sponsor. Obviously, I'm going to use their odds. But I want to talk about actual Missouri odds right now and what they tell me. And quite frankly, they tell me, long story short, yes, just like the media only picked one guy to put on the 3 all-SEC preseason teams there, well, Missouri still a little bit underestimated, or there appears to be, at the very least to me, a little anti-Mizzou bias here in some ways. Why? I'm not entirely sure, but it sure seems to exist when, quite frankly, as I've said on this program before, I'm definitely high on the Ole Miss Rebels this season, but really not any higher than I am on Missouri. I think both teams are kind of right about where they were last season to me at this point. Two really good offenses, could be even better offenses this season in 2024 that are right there. Definite playoff contenders, no question about that. But it is odd to me to see that the Rebels are minus 125 to make the playoff, while the Tigers are plus 180. Again, we talked about spreads earlier, and I thought, hey, 8 versus 10, AP versus S&P Plus, that's negligible. Well, that's significant. Minus 125. In other words, you got to bet $12.50 to win 10 versus betting 10 to win 18. My goodness, that is a massive, massive difference. And certainly that plays itself out too on the championship level as well. Ole Miss 7.5 to 1 to win the SEC, while the Tigers are 23 to 1. Again, I just don't quite understand those particular spreads. Now, again, in my opinion, again, nothing against Ole Miss whatsoever. I'm very high on the Rebels. I think their offense is going to be borderline unstoppable at times this year, especially that passing game that complements the running game quite well for the Rebels. But to me, if Ole Miss is that high, I think Missouri should be just as high. So maybe, I don't know, you guys tell me, or is the nation, is Vegas, as it were, are they too high on Ole Miss, or are they too low on Missouri, or some combination of both? And following my discussion about whether Luther Burden could become the greatest receiver in Missouri history after 2024, well, I talked a lot about Jeremy Maclin in that show, and I had a lot of people say, hey, don't forget about Danario Alexander, who I, of course, mentioned as well, but I totally understand the love for Danario. In my opinion, that 2009 season is the best single season I've seen by a Missouri receiver. I think I'd still give Jeremy Maclin, for example, the nod just because, well, again, his 2 seasons were just, to me, bigger than the totality of Denario's 4 years at Missouri. We can argue about that if you would like. But again, a lot of people had some love for Danario Alexander, and to all the people who said, hey, if his knees hadn't blown up, he would have been a stud in the NFL too. Couldn't agree more. People like BRM Handle on YouTube were saying this, and he also said, to me, Luther Burden's legacy will be more about what his team accomplishes rather than his individual stats. He has already shown a knack for clutch moments in the Cotton Bowl, K-State, Florida games last year. If this team achieves what I think it is capable of, he is by far the most consequential athlete in Mizzou history. An SEC championship and a deep CFP run led by him and Cook would be the stuff of fairy tales and permanently change Mizzou's place in the college football landscape. There would be no better case study for NIL and its impacts. So, wow, fabulously well said there, first of all, and I think I completely agree with everything you said there. If I didn't emphasize it enough last time, I totally agree. I do think it is ultimately probably going to be more about the team accomplishments, because with a similar target share, for example, this season, Burden's probably going to become almost certainly going to become the all-time leading receiver for Missouri. So I totally agree. Whether this is fair or not, we're talking about legacy here, and people's memories are not always perfect or fair or representative of the perfect statistical analysis. So, in fact, I totally agree with you on every level in this comment here. So, very well said by BRM Handle. And more on the receivers from John Sadler, who said, I'd like to see career stats on all MU wide receivers, but normalized per game numbers and maybe percentage of offensive production. Mel Gray, Henry Marshall, Justin Gage, and I'm sure a few more I can't name right now. And quite honestly, I hear the spirit of what John is saying there completely, because there's no doubt that there's a definite bias against wide receivers that came before, let's say, the 1990s or so, when the passing game in college really started to take off, just statistically, even in the NFL, other than Jerry Rice, for example. For the most part, because of the passage of time and just looking back at statistics these days, the advancement of the passing game, well, most receivers, when you talk about the greatest of all time, most of them are modern guys, relatively modern guys that have been post Jerry Rice. So how to exactly quantify all of that, I think, is really difficult. But I do feel bad that guys like you say, Mel Gray and Henry Marshall in particular, Justin Gage as well, but in particular guys from a much more run-heavy era, it is hard to totally just gauge how good they were versus guys like Jeremy Maclin and Luther Burden, who played in an utterly different era of passing and offensive production. So well said there, and I agree with you, and I don't have a perfect answer there whatsoever. I do feel bad, though, that receivers from that era are just somewhat dismissed, I would say, unfairly. The problem is I don't have a great answer as to how to quantify all of that. You know what? In certain moments, for one snap, of course, the place kicker can be absolutely the most important person on the field. But for the majority of the season, maybe even the entire season, they can be almost inconsequential, at least when compared to a realistic replacement. So if you disagree with that, well, I think dollars and cents, number one, are going to prove my point pretty definitively. So let's talk more about the place kicker position and its relative importance to the 2024 Tigers coming up after these quick words. So generally speaking, if you think it's the place kicker in a less than in a 3-point or less ball game, for example, if you think Harrison Mevis, if he was the one who won the Florida game, in your opinion, well, in my opinion, you've completely discounted everything that came before it. Just in terms of importance, the aforementioned 4th and 17 Luther Burden's catch, well, clearly that was the do-or-die play of the game and not a 30-yard field goal. Now, again, of course, for that one moment, the kick, yes, if he missed the 30-yarder, well, then hell, we would have lost the game. So for that moment, obviously Mevis was the most important guy on the field. But what about the other 140 snaps that came before it? You know, touchdowns are worth more than field goals, by the way. And speaking of the value of field goals, I was reminded, speaking of the Florida game last year, Trey Smack was the name of the Florida kicker. Let's think about that. His name is Trey, as in 3, Smack, as in he smacks the ball with his foot. If that's not the greatest name for a place kicker of all time, I'm not really sure what is. But I digress. Again, for one play, obviously, then he's quite important. But for the vast majority of college football games, they simply are not decided by a place kick. And to a commenter, Kai, out there, thanks to Kai, I think he's an everydayer, he says, FYI, kickers are always the highest scoring players on the team year in and year out, so they're kind of important. Well, okay, I feel your condescension there. I can be a little passive-aggressive myself, by the way. So here's an FYI for you. Yes, Harrison Mevis, the leading scorer for Missouri last year. Did you know that 45, though, of his 117 points, more than 1/3 of his points scored, were PATs? And more to the point, you know, replacement level kickers, heck, I can probably make a PAT. I can't make much beyond 30 yards, but I can make a PAT. And more to the point here, do you think the difference between Missouri and Alabama the past 15 seasons, for example, has been kickers? Heck, Missouri, I would argue, has had better kickers than Alabama during that period. In fact, Missouri has been pretty spoiled with good place kickers, I would say. And that's part of the reason why, quite honestly, I'm not that worried about the kicker position. I think Blake Craig is going to be fine. To other people who've said, hey, I think Blake Craig's going to be good. Again, that's why I'm not that worried about kicker. One of many reasons that I'm not worried about kicker. And another everydayer here, John Berger, says if Mevis doesn't miss 2 field goals against LSU, we win that game, even if he makes 1. Auburn 2 years ago. 2021, I think the kicker and punter are huge. I think Blake Craig is going to be great. Well, again, I agree that Blake Craig is going to be great, but to your whole, one play thing, well, what about against LSU last year? Jaden Daniels, there's a 3rd and 5 just inside of Missouri territory. If he doesn't run for, what was it, a 40-yard touchdown or something like that on a scramble, guess what? If we just make a stop there, force an LSU punt, well, we probably win that game too. How is that linebacker or safety or whoever could have made that tackle not every bit as important, if not more so, in that one moment, for just one moment, than a place kicker? Frankly, all of this sort of make-miss coin flip thing, sometimes it's all a little bit of retrospective thinking. Again, I'm talking about the bigger picture of the entire squad, not about an important position at a critical moment that frankly may or may not come up. The kicker matters sometimes, but not enough that any of you, for example, have been able to point out a season that was derailed by a Missouri place kicker. Yes, there's been moments, games we've lost, but what I'm trying to think about here is what can I predict for the 2024 season? What can I feel reasonably confident in counting on? Well, I can certainly count on a good passing game, a good running game, a good defense, much more than I can count on a place kicker. There's just so many more snaps on offense and defense versus place kicking. And again, the leading scorer thing, hey, great. Every kicker should be able to make a PAT in a 30-yarder in 2024 in the SEC. They really should. A replacement level SEC kicker should be able to perform that particular task. And bottom line here, again, dollars and cents, there's a reason that kickers don't make money in the NFL, folks. There just is. Justin Tucker, who is considered by many to be certainly the best kicker in today's football, maybe the greatest kicker of all time, he makes $6 million a year, and he's by far the highest paid kicker in the league. Well, for example, our old buddy Chase Daniel, who's got his own YouTube page going these days too, he thinks Jordan Love, the Green Bay Packers quarterback, is going to get more than $50 million per season. Is Jordan Love a top 5 quarterback in the NFL? I don't know, but that's a heck of a lot of money. All I know is that every single position in the NFL that isn't a special teams position like punter or long snapper or something, every single position in the NFL, on the offensive line, the defensive line, the secondary, skill players, I don't care who it is, they all make more money than the kickers. Is every single team in the NFL that stupid? I find that kind of hard to believe. And by the way, if you're going, well, that's NFL versus college, hey, let me know the first time you hear about a kicker who is getting a big name, image, and likeness deal, because that'll be a first for this podcaster. So you know what? Here's the thing. I think part of the reason some people are overrating the kicker position for Missouri right now, Mevis really had a high amount of pressure / game-winning kicks in his tenure. For example, as great as Jeff Wolfert was for Missouri, I really can't think of a walk-off field goal for him off the top of my head other than the Alamo Bowl, I believe, 2008. So the opportunity just never presented itself that much because Missouri just wasn't in all that many close games during this period. So why are we just assuming that Missouri's going to need a walk-off field goal to win one or multiple games this season? There's a decent chance that doesn't happen at all. I guarantee we'll block and tackle. If I can guarantee that we'll block well and tackle well and have good corner play and all that stuff, well then guess what? We'll score touchdowns, not field goals, and that's what really matters. Advanced stats and just frankly basic math teaches us no clearer lesson than that. So God knows I hope Blake Craig is good. There definitely could be a moment this year where, who knows, Missouri could make or miss a critical kick and you'll all be pointing at me going, ha, see, you were wrong. If you say that, I think you're missing the point. I really do. But regardless, thanks as always for listening to Locked On Mizzou here today. Appreciate you everydayers. As always, especially quite honestly, when you give me some good comments to jump off of, whether I agree or disagree, keep them coming. It's just good content. I always love the discussion. So until next time, I am John Miller, and this has been Locked on Mizzou.